Hello and welcome to College Admissions with Mark and Anna. Each week we talk about different college admissions topics and answer those tough questions you may be dealing with concerning getting into the college of your choice. We know how stressful this process can be, so each episode we try to make it easier to navigate. Now, here are your hosts, Anna Wren and Mark Hofer.
Hi, and welcome to the College Admissions Podcast with your hosts, Anna Wren and
Mark Hofer.
We're so excited because it's August and the Common Application is live, right, Mark?
Yep, it came whether we wanted it or not, and we are into the application season officially, August 1st.
Yes, and I think as we talk about real applications, it's really important for students to identify what are good colleges or universities for them to apply to, especially because the Common App is capped. I don't know, but some students don't know that it's capped at 20 schools, which I think is more than plenty. But if your list is like edging towards 30 to 50, know that you can only apply to 20 via that application. So I think it's a good idea to talk about like what students should consider as they, finalize their list for colleges.
Absolutely. And you bring up a good question. How many colleges do you have students apply to? What are the ranges that you tell students, here's a good range or a number of schools, and this is the reason why? What do you tell students?
Such a great question. It actually depends on their high school, which sounds a little crazy, but like certain high schools are more competitive, and depending on what their list looks like, if they are quote unquote dead set on applying to a largely selective list of schools, then I recommend that they maybe apply 12 to 15. But if they're not necessarily at a crazy competitive high school, or they're not necessarily going for crazy selective and they're doing the whole best fit approach, then typically it's like 10 to 12. How about you, Mark?
Yeah, I have students. I usually, when we start out talking about a list, you'll start out with 15, 20 schools, but narrowing that list. And I really encourage students to keep it down to 8 to 12. And the reason for that is becoming, seniors are so overwhelmed with senior academics that by the time that wave hits and they're trying to do applications, they think, well, I'll have all this time during the summer, which they never do. And then they dive into writing essays and applications. And the next thing you know, well, if you're trying to apply to 15 schools, you just don't have the time. So it becomes a real issue of identifying which schools you're going to have the highest probability of getting into and applying to those with your best possible application. But you bring up a good point. So explain what you mean by, depending on the high school, how many colleges that they would apply to.
So many high schools in New Jersey are crazy competitive in terms of rank and other things here. So it is like, for example, the norm to apply to 15 to 20 colleges for those students. And a good chunk of those are typically extremely competitive schools. So depending on what high school and what their track record, for example, is in Naviance and things like that, then we might skew a little upwards. Now, you bring up a great point though, Mark, because I have a rule where you cannot send out an application where you sacrifice quality for quantity. And so what I have my students do is, put them in, it's kind of weird, but it is kind of like triaging your applications. Yep. So I don't know what the medical term is, but basically we'll identify waves. So you're going to put like the most urgent or most desired schools you definitely want to go to, and we'll batch them and say, okay, once we, finish these up, then you can start the next set. So that way it's never sacrificing quality for quantity. And that's how we try to get through it and know that, okay, if we don't get through all of them, we don't get through all of them. But at least you got to send out quality applications for the schools that are most important to you.
Agreed. That actually is a really good, and I like that kind of hierarchical approach in that you're addressing the ones that are top schools for you, and you've identified that these are the ones that are most important and putting the most effort into those. And as time becomes available, you can address the ones further down the list. That's actually a good approach. I know that one thing I end up with students who have all these great ambitions to apply to X schools. And then when it comes down to the essay, and they just do not have the time, and they know, putting in a bad essay is not going to be a step in the right direction. So it's better to, like you say, address those that are most important first. And as time allows, address those further down the list.
Yes. And we've found that works well, because I have some students that are just adamant about applying to 20 plus schools. And while I don't necessarily cover support for that many, typically it's a approach I recommend. It often comes in for special programs like BSMD and things like that. They want to still keep their options open. So we found that it works, and they know that they have to start their applications like early. like a long time ago. Yes. Like a long time ago, months in advance.
Exactly. So when you are, granted, now the application is out, common application is upon us, and we've been talking about schools and school lists and what kind of schools are available. And as a counselor, the evolution of a student's, preferences and what they really are looking for in a school change dramatically from the time they're sophomores to even, come the day before applications are due. So during that period of time, what are some of the guiding things that you have students use to identify what's going to be the school they're applying to?
So I think I use Coursava. I do believe students can create a free account on their website, but It's to, like I said before, you need to identify the factors that are most important to you. So being able to break it out, and sometimes students don't even realize that these are factors for them, right? Until they've been asked the question. So everything from size to setting, sometimes that's different from location as well. I don't know if you've ever had this, but students tell me hey, I want a campus, but I also want to be in a city. There are colleges that actually satisfy that. Not a lot, but there are that do satisfy that. But anything from that to it has to have great research opportunities, or it has to, for example, especially for parents, it has to yield a return on investment. So having those pre-professional opportunities. So I think those are all different factors that we have them consider. But we start with the Coursava sort to kind of figure that out.
Very good. So even a step earlier than that, so we like students immediately want to get into, I want schools, I want to build my list. And I have a really hard time having them take a step back, take the 10,000 foot view, and just ask them, well, what do you think a good school is? And then listening to them talk about all of these different characteristics. And then I ask them, but is it a good school for you? And have them take that approach of not listening to all of the cacophony that we hear from, the media about what a good school is, but really, what's a good school for you? And does the media, what they present as a good school, does that necessarily mean it's good for you? So how do you use Coursava, and which is a great tool to start that conversation? And how do you press students to take a step back and really ask, so is it good for me? What's most important to me? How do you do that?
I think a few things we talk about is, what would you need to thrive and succeed, not just academically, but also personally, pre-professionally, and think about those factors. Because I think, just like you probably encounter, a lot of students start with the ranking lists, right?
Yep.
And there's one that's most popular that we don't necessarily recommend students start with. So I think it's first identifying that. One of my favorite questions to ask students is, how do you learn best? Because that will help you also identify what kind of college is, right? So if you're a hands-on learner, if you thrive on discussion-based learning, so I think that's definitely one of the questions I ask, but also what kind of support they would need to transition to that school and thrive personally, because I've worked with transfers before, and they usually pick their list initially based on rank. And then they learn, oh, this wasn't actually a good school for me. And we go back, right? And let's have that conversation again. How about you, Mark?
Yeah, and that's exactly it. Having some of those foundational questions answered and have that conversation about, especially, I mean, one of my favorite conversations is with transfer students and basically finding out what wasn't asked that could have prevented this. And you get really great answers about, I wish somebody would have had me answer X, even if it was, what's most important to me. Well, when you talk to representatives, finance comes up, and it's amazing how many students, they want to look at the rankings, but they don't look at the price tag, or they haven't had that conversation with their parents. And it's one of the most common reasons that students drop out or have to transfer. So that's like you say, identify those things. Let's take another look at this and find out what's really important or what's really good for you. So what are you use Coursava. Are there other go-to tools that you have students answer questions about, or are there specific questions that over the years you found are especially telling or especially valuable in finding out, okay, this is one of the characteristics that we really need to look at?
I think one of them is, how do you envision what life will be like day to day at college? So what are some activities you'll enjoy? And that I learned from a transfer student. She wanted to be able to explore off campus, but she was at a school that it wasn't safe to do that after daylight hours. So she realized that that was really important to her. The other question I often ask is like, how do you see your life post graduation too? And kind of what college would enable that. So that part of it, I think, is like the finance question, like you mentioned before, but it's also opportunities and things like that. How about you, Mark?
Yeah, it's funny. One of the questions that I ask students and I try to identify are things that you mentioned. The one, which is the most common thing that I'm being asked by students now is it a safe school? That was that, and I don't know if that's coming out of COVID or what's driving that, but that has become probably a driving factor for at least 20% of the students I'm working with this year is the school safe? And getting information on that is an interesting quest on its own. So that's one of the common ones. The other ones that I have a lot of students, I use Coursava to open up the questions. But many of those questions have to do with what you mentioned, that day to day. Do you really know what a college day is like? And have you talked to enough college students to find out, these are the things that help me be successful academic? And that may be laundry, it may be food, it may be, access to transportation. But I don't think a lot of students actually take the time to say, these are important things that are directly related to my academic success. So yeah, I appreciate it. Like you said, let's take a look at those things first as well. What are some of the things, what are some of the other things that you found that are the primary characteristics that students are looking for when they're looking at colleges? What are the prime drivers?
I think these days it is driven by return on investment, which yields back to the opportunities they have. So like, I think Northeastern has been really popular. I don't know if it's been that case for you as well amongst my students and parents, because they're like, oh, my kid or my student might not be as outgoing in finding those internships by themselves, but having the co-op at Northeastern, it makes them feel more confident to know that, quote unquote, they'd be supported, right, in pursuing those opportunities. So I think that's been one. I think the other one, like you said, is safety. I'm not really sure where that's coming from. I don't know if like the media has sparked that because they're reporting more crime maybe lately. I think that's been a big one. Outside of that, some of them, it's trying to find a compromise. So I don't know if you have this problem too, but like where they can still get support and like smaller class sizes and relationships with their professors, but then they want those like large college resources, in which case I often direct them to honors programs. But if you have a different way of trying to find that, compromise, please let me know. But those are a few of the things that are driving it for me.
Those are definitely, now I think the interesting part about media is I think some of the things that brings to students' attention are really healthy. And I think safety is a good one. That's something they should be aware of. One of the other pieces that's come out is you start hearing about it. It's much more prevalent in media now is student debt. And there are lots of stories about people who are, 10, 15, 20 years later that are still paying off student debt. And I mentioned to students, when you're picking your school, how are you going to pay for it? What kind of debt are you going to graduate with? Because you are making a lifestyle choice. Because if you graduate with a lot of debt, there are a lot of the things that you associate with having a comfortable lifestyle that you won't be able to do. And I think as soon as I frame it that way, like you said, what do you envision school being like, or life being like after school? As soon as you identify, well, if you've got this debt, that's going to change and modify what life is going to be like. So that's one of the ways I get into the conversation with students about how much debt do you really want to take on? How expensive of a school do you really want to go to? So that's one of those things of getting to some of the more foundational questions, I think. How about you?
I love that you said lifestyle choice because, it wasn't so long ago, a few months ago, when seniors were making their final decisions, right, about where they were going to college. And as is common in my culture, Asian culture, rank and reputation is at the forefront. But I think that has to do with like where their parents came from college. And that was important there, but it's different in America. But I remember one of the conversations being like, my student was trying to decide between getting a free ride for a BSMD and then attending an Ivy and a few other options, but there would be no money that came with that. And so I just asked him the question, what do you want? Like, what is important to you? Yep. Forget the parents for a second, because dad's like, no, but we heard from friends, like it's so important to attend an Ivy. And I'm like, but let's talk for a second. You worked really hard on these applications. What's important to you? And he was like, I really want to be a doctor as soon as possible. And I already went through the medical school application round this time. And I would rather save that money towards opening my own practice one day. And I was like, so there you go. You already know the answer. So I think it's important to have those kinds of conversations because money is a real thing. And I've talked about this with my husband before, because I'll often get like parents from like Asian or South Asian backgrounds, especially, will say, oh, we'll find the money. And I told my husband, I was like, but where does money come from? Like, does it magically appear that they can find it? Is it, because I would like to know where I can find this money for my kids to go to college if it's so easy to do that. So I really encourage families to kind of have those conversations, when it comes to ROI, especially.
Yeah, especially with medical school, this is something near and dear to my heart. And we know that we're going to need people to take care of us as we get older. So I've got skin in the game, literally. And so with that in mind, I have conversations with students who, they immediately come in and I'm going to be a doctor. I want to go pre-med. And then one of the first conversations I have with them is letting them know, the lifestyle choice, because you're going to graduate with over $500,000 in debt. Are you okay with that? Because especially if you're going into specialties that don't necessarily pay a whole lot, you're going to be paying that debt for a long time. And I don't think it's fair to have a 17 or 18-year-old go in with all the best ambition and best intention and have them realize I'm on a train, 6 years down the line and realize this train it's not sustainable. I can't pay for this and be a happy, healthy human being. So having those conversations, especially with those students who are headed into high debt graduation, it's just part of the conversation I think is really important. So when you are identifying schools and you're trying to help students identify what's important to them. We're putting in all kinds of information. We're collecting everything that they want about the school, including, like you said, it can be location and size and what kind of majors they're going to choose, those kind of things. What are some of the tools that you have students use and some of the tools that you use that help identify schools that provide those things?
Great question. So I really love information sessions and opportunities to talk with actual students. So I don't know if many students know that, but like some universities, even really large ones and public ones, sometimes offer the opportunity to just have like a 15-minute chat with a current student. And I highly recommend that. But some of my favorite online tools or kind of online tools probably be College Navigator to get some basic facts. I also really like the College Express lists. They're more unique. So like you do sometimes have students who have very unique preferences from like, I don't know if this, you're probably not surprised at all, but like college food is really important for for some of my students. And I completely understand, like, you're going to live there 4 years. You really want to be able to be healthy. And that includes food, or like maybe a certain scene, like they want Greek life or, school spirit. But if those are important to them, I think College Express has some amazing lists for that. And then the other one I like, which I'm not sure if they kept their online platform. They had it and then it kind of disappeared. But the FIS Guide, at least you can get the books for the FIS Guide, those are some of my favorites. How about you, Mark?
Yeah, I use College Express quite a bit, just especially for those niche areas, especially if it's something I don't know. There are niche areas. Since I'm a glassblower, I actually and I always want to find out who actually has a glass blowing, and happens to be MIT. So I like those for those niche areas that a student might be interested in having either access to or even majoring in. Those are always fun. I do use FIS Guide a lot. One of the things I like about FIS Guide is it's updated yearly.
Yes.
And I think that's especially important after COVID because colleges are different. And I find that a lot of times when I visit a campus and I talk to a lot of students and I write my notes and I write them out about, this is what the college feels like and this is who I talk to. A lot of times FIS is, 75 to 80% of what I experience there. So I kind of trust that as a really good go-to. Another one is Niche, of course. That's a really common, easy access, free tool.
Yes.
And all of these tools are good first approximations. And I tell students, just realize these are tools that are great resources, but they are a first approximation of reality in that they're one source of data and you don't necessarily know where they're getting their data or how they're making what's important. So be sure that you understand it is a snapshot of their reality, not necessarily reality.
Yes, that is absolutely true, because I think we purposely, or maybe not purposely, mentioned a certain common ranking guide. But I think for people wondering, it's probably because it's not to say that has no merit. I do think sometimes they have very interesting lists, for example, by major or by like financial need met and things like that. But I think something to kind of keep in mind is kind of the purpose of these lists, I know, and kind of what data is being measured with these lists. So it's not to say you can't use that list. I think like any of the places we've mentioned, it's a starting point, but definitely cross-check it against other data you're going to find from other resources.
Agreed. Yeah, I have students. As a matter of fact, that's just one of the things I think in being an informed and conscious, citizen and individual is how you move through the world and ask yourself, well, where did this information come from? And I have students, I let them know. I say, if you're going to use an aggregate that basically lists, let's just say the top 100 X schools. If you're using something like that, find out what are they using to generate that list hierarchy. And if donations from alumni is really important to you, well then, okay, that's a great list for that. But if that's not one of the things that you consider to be a component or characteristic of a good school or a good school for you, it's probably not the best way to find information that you're really wanting to know about finding your best school. So make sure that you do a little bit of secondary digging on where did they get their information and how did they generate what is best, or what did they label as best and how they got there. So that's really important, not only for college, but for everything.
Yes. But let's dive into some specific bests. So I think you are the go-to for STEM, right? So what are some of your favorite colleges that you would recommend for those interested in areas related to STEM?
See, and now we get to take a step back. And since, a number of the students I work with come to me because my background in STEM gives me a different perspective on what I think is important to be successful or successfully educated and prepared to enter that industry. So I have I actually have those students, take a shot at a different layer of what's best for you. A lot of times what I really push, and you mentioned one of them, is the co-op or internship. And there again, Northeastern and University of Cincinnati, they are the leaders in, we want you to experience the job world of what you're going to, basically graduate in and hopefully get a job. We want you to experience what that real industry is like before you get into it. And also those internships and introductions to the networks of people in those industries is invaluable. So one of the things is, do they have a co-op? Do they have internships available? And will you be able to participate those and graduate on time? Because there are different programs where you can participate, but then you graduate longer, or, you have to add on another year. Yeah. And so keep that in mind. Cost is important. The other one is research. If you're going to go into STEM and you haven't had a chance to do research as an undergrad, those are things you really need to consider as part of not only the internship component, but also the hands-on and doing research. And there are two lists that I keep in my head when I talk to students about that. And you can go, if you're going to go to a school that has an exorbitant tuition fee, they had better have opportunities available for their undergraduate students to do research. The common high price tag, the leaders are, MIT and Rice and Cornell, University of Chicago, Caltech. All of those have outstanding research available to their students. But also, if price tag is a huge component of where you go to school, that doesn't mean you have to sacrifice having the chance to do research, because there are schools like RIT or Rochester Institute, I guess, University of Wisconsin, a bigger state school. And if you want to go smaller, there's a really good research school in Iowa called Coe College that's one of the things they thrive on. So I just want students to realize, if you do a little digging and research using some of the tools we talk about, you can find schools that are high price tag, medium price tag, and lower price tag that can offer the things that are most important to you. So those are important things for STEM. How about you? What are some of the characteristics that you have students and schools that are looking, schools that they should look at?
I think for me, I work with, obviously I do have some STEM students, but a lot of students interested in business. And so a lot of times they think they have to go to fancy schools. And I think business is kind of unique, where it's more so on the program and not necessarily national rank. So it's really about opportunities. And so some of my favorites are Indiana University, Kelly. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere. But once you get over that part, it's definitely got one of the most beautiful campuses, and they have an honors program as well. And they really emphasize experiential learning through their program for business as well. And I think it's really great for students. I would also say that Obviously, Michigan, Wharton, Stern, they're all very common, Georgetown, Northeastern. But there's also the small schools too, right? Or Babson. Or, for example, people don't think about it, but like a tech school like Georgia Tech actually has an amazing business program. So I think sometimes students need to think outside the box a little bit when it comes to their programs and think about where are they going to get those opportunities. Along with that, it's been really interesting. I don't know if you've seen this lately, Mark, amongst colleges or STEM schools, but they're adding these like innovation hubs where there's this cross section between business and STEM for like entrepreneurship and like startup culture. And I think like UC Berkeley has it. I just saw today that Rose-Hulman is launching one. They just got like, I think one of their biggest grants ever. So they're launching one. Georgia Tech, we mentioned before, in addition to other schools like RIT or, Michigan, Ann Arbor and things like that. So I think those are some of the ones that get some of my students excited too.
And I'm glad you brought up Babson. It's one of these schools where, and I think if you work with somebody who finding out boutique colleges and what colleges really have to offer, if you're working with somebody who can help you, that's their life. You find out like Babson is right across the street from Olin College of Engineering, which I believe is one of the best engineering colleges in the world. But then you find out, well, wait a second, there is a collaboration between Babson, a business school, and Olin, a very much engineering school. And you find out that the dorms at Olin were built on funding from Babson. And then you find out, wait, you can take classes at both schools. So if you're going to go into STEM, and I tell STEM students, the best thing you can do is get a minor in psychology or business, because these are going to be things that will make you much more successful in industry. And so knowing those things, those little pieces that can make your education more cost effective and more efficient in your 4 years, those are all big wins. And the reason why you should do some of the research and use some of the tools that we talked about.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I didn't mention it before, but sometimes liberal arts colleges, I think Babson is considered a liberal arts college, although that probably surprises a lot of people because they think it's just about like the arts. But like, for example, liberal arts colleges are valuable too, because you can use the skills you gain from a liberal arts college and apply it across industries. So like, for example, my brother didn't go to business school. He went to Williams, a liberal arts college, again, in the middle of nowhere. And he, one of the cool things that someone had said before is that they hired him because he has unique perspective. And it's definitely been cultivated in terms of his analysis skills and things like that by getting a liberal arts education. So I think those should be also looked into for certain students. It might be a really great opportunity for them. It might help them thrive in certain general skill sets as well.
The liberal arts moniker, and matter of fact, I had a student yesterday and sit down and said, I just don't know, what does that mean? My parents are against me going to a liberal arts college. And I said, okay, well, let me just explain, because maybe you can have this conversation with them. Liberal arts in general is just kind of a label for their mission that you're going to think, read, write, and communicate effectively. That's their mission. When you graduate, you're going to do that, but you're also going to get a degree in an area, and that could be a science. And to give you an example, one of the best engineering schools in the entire world is Harvey Mudd in California.
Yes.
And it is a liberal arts college. So students will say, well, how's that possible? And I say, well, they have a mandatory set of writing classes. They believe that you will be most successful both financially and personally if you graduate knowing how to think, write, and communicate effectively as a person in science. And I having hired lots of engineers and scientists, I can tell you, I am on board with that all day long. So yes, I think having that liberal arts conversation, that it isn't necessarily just humanities.
And I think you raised such a great point, especially post-COVID, we've seen students struggle with communication, whether it be written or oral. And I think in that sense, that liberal arts background might be really important, because you have to go, well, you need the writing skills, right, for your resume or your cover letter, but then you also need those oral communication skills for your interview. So again, there is merit, I believe, in a liberal arts education. And again, we go back to the question of what is the right school for you in terms of what are your goals and kind of how you hope to stretch yourself in the future.
Your point about, and I'm going to start using this. I'm appropriating your, what does college look like after college? I mean, what does your life look like after college is such a great way to get that conversation started about, well, how are you going to get there and what does it feel like when you do? And I really love that. There's one of the things that I have been pushing on students to understand, that you do have to graduate, and schools that retain their students mean that they're satisfying the needs of students overall. So one of the things I've really had students pay attention to is graduation rate. That's graduation rate in 4 years. And there are some schools that do that exceptionally well. And there are others that aren't so successful in graduating students in 4 years. So with that in mind, I tell them, you want to graduate in 4 years, otherwise you're assuming debt. And if you don't graduate at all, that's a bad sign. So what are some of the schools that you let students know these are schools that students graduate from?
That's such a great point. I believe, so first of all, that data is readily available.
Yep.
So everything from like Boston College to, Columbia and very, I think, well-funded schools or well-known schools, but there's also less well-known schools like we talked about, like you mentioned Olin before. So that is definitely important, is that 4-year graduation rate. The other rate I encourage them to explore is that retention rate after the first year as well.
First year.
Because that will indicate, hopefully, that whether or not students are happy at that school. And so that is the other statistic. Are there any other colleges that you recommend based on their graduation rate?
Well, I don't necessarily recommend them just for the graduate, but it is one of those things. I mean, I love Carleton all day long, and I think they do things successfully, which helps students be happy and healthy and successful. So they've got an almost 90% success. I generally tell students if they are approaching 80%, that's a really good spot. I mean, that's where you want to be, 80 or above. But when I speak with representatives of schools, one of the most common questions I ask them is, for those students who don't come back next the sophomore year, what are the most common reasons? And I can tell you 90% of the time they say it's finances. And it's basically they got into a situation where it's unsustainable for them to, as you pointed out, find the money. and either they hadn't prepared, weren't aware of scholarships, didn't apply for them, weren't, eligible for, or whatever reason. But finances is a huge part of the reason why schools don't have that second year retention.
And that's extremely unfortunate, right, Mark? And, I think about it because we live on the East Coast, and I know it came out in articles that a lot of the schools in Boston are over $90,000 a year cost of attendance. And like New York schools are over $100,000 a year cost of attendance. And so I think it's really important to have those conversations. This also especially goes out to any kids applying early decision.
Yep.
Because you need to know that it's like not going to magically appear that you will get money necessarily. And there's so many misconceptions about like financial aid and merit aid, and it's not necessarily guaranteed. Definitely run those calculators. But I think it is important to look. I feel like, I don't know if you have this issue with some of the families you work with, but they often only look at tuition instead of full cost of attendance. And there is a big gap between the two.
Yep. Well, and that's when you talk about the other thing that they don't put into that equation is times 4. So when we talk about early decision, they might have one number in mind. They might have 85 in mind. And so I say to them, okay, fine. But if you're going to apply early decision, let's just take worst case scenario. You get zero money, but it does happen.
It does.
So if you get zero money, it's 85,000 times 4. Are you ready to take on that kind of a price tag? And that at least, you get to put the number of zeros in the right order. And that, it can be a daunting when you're looking at $350,000 and it's okay. How are you going to do that? That can change the conversation, and it can change your list because there are other opportunities. And like we mentioned, find those schools that provide the things that make it a good school for you. And if price tag is one of the driving components of that, you have to consider it.
I add an extra layer of reality to that. So I actually say, and keep in mind, tuition goes up on average 2 to 5%, sometimes more every year. So just take that into account as well in terms of, because when I started college, this was ages ago, but between the time I started and the time I ended, cost of attendance had gone up 25%. Like if you
from the time you started to the time that you
graduated,
left,
yes. So
25% different.
Yes.
Wow.
And so it was such a big amount that we hadn't we didn't think about at the time. I mean, I obviously was taking out loans and stuff, but that is really important to consider as well. There are certain colleges that have tuition freezes, not many, but there are a few. But in general, just know that price doesn't necessarily stay the same all 4 years either.
Well, and then, we've got Vanderbilt who just announced their $100,000 price tag for the coming year. And as soon as they do, as soon as somebody opens the door of the 6 figures, that other schools are going to follow because they don't want to feel cheap, as it were. So we know that number keeps going up, and it is, have we reached a ceiling or a glass ceiling or a bubble yet? We don't know. So that will be an interesting crystal ball question for 5-10 years down the line.
Yes. Going back though to best colleges for you, is there anything else that you would suggest or offer, Mark?
Well, and one of the tough things to have the conversation around is, and we try not to bring our bias into it. At least I hope every counselor and consultant tries to be as objective as possible. But we also, many of us who have worked with students long enough, we've seen what that looks like, that progression through high school into college and into real life. And we try to protect students from themselves, especially when they're 17 and 18 years old, and what they think is most important to them now. And then having talked to students for 10 years down the line, you find out that is an evolution. You try to protect them or have them ask questions that will get them, thinking, what does life look like after college? And I think those are the conversations, the most important thing, just trying to have them, project, yes, I know this is really most important to you, but from taking a objective standpoint, you try to frame it. So why is it most important to you? And will it continue to be important to you? And trying to have those conversations before you even have a school list, I think is really important.
Awesome. That's such great feedback and advice for families everywhere. Any closing thoughts, Mark?
Yeah, I want to know let's end with what's one of the unique areas that you've had a student who said, no, I really want a program in X. And you say, you know what? I don't know about that, but let me do some digging and research, and where you found out that there were colleges that had a program in X. What's one of the more interesting ones?
I'm trying to think. I don't know if we're just more quote unquote conservative on the East Coast, but we don't have a lot of those requests. I think the most recent one, or the most newer or less common majors recently, have been public health, which I think has become a lot more popular post-pandemic for obvious reasons. And the other one would be recently I had a student ask about architecture. And so that has been interesting as well for me, not being in that space to find colleges that cover that. But it's been really interesting because like we've discovered, for example, that there's a school, I guess they're engineering and arts, but Cooper Union in New York City also has architecture. And then I believe the other one we had come across was like MIT. Was another one where we wouldn't have necessarily expected it, but obviously still exploring and stuff like that. How about you?
Yeah, well, and you brought up MIT, so I have to give a shout out to MIT's Glass Lab, which is actually, this is one of those crazy things that you learn when you're researching schools. So Glass Lab at MIT is the most applied to class because it's hard to get into at MIT. And it's the only program at MIT that is self-sustained funding. So what they sell of their product that they make in class actually sustains the program. How cool is that?
That is so cool.
Yeah. And if you haven't seen they have glass pumpkins in October that they put out all over the campus on the field, and people come by and they buy glass pumpkins, and they're really cool. It's a beautiful time of year. One of the interesting ones that this has been a recent is professional pilot programs, and finding out that there are schools that, they are the 4 leaders in preparing pilots for that profession and industry, and finding out that, North Dakota and Purdue and Embry-Riddle, and talk about very different programs and very different locations and missions and how they generate them, is a perfect example of why you do your research on your schools, especially if you're looking for something that is unique to you and it's going to make you healthier and happier when you're on campus. So that was the most recent fun one.
That is really fun. I didn't even know that. So that's really exciting. I love that. So in closing, we hope everyone remembers that as you finalize your list, or maybe if you're not a senior and you're building your list, to focus and ask yourself those deep questions of what's important to you and let that guide your college application journey.
Yep. What's important and why.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Anna.
Thanks for listening to College Admissions with Mark and Anna, where we make getting into college easy and fun. Don't forget to go over to iTunes and subscribe to get updated each time we release a new episode. Also, for more helpful college admissions information, visit our website at www.collegeadmissionspodcast.com.